pick different passages and they kind of put together like a puzzle to try to convince you of their point. And if you saw today, we jumped around a couple different places from Luke to Mark and so on and back and forth. And the reason why is because I wanted us to get a theme going to see what Jesus is doing here. There is a theme, and if you notice that he's always withdrawing. He's always going to a silent place to pray. He's always going off on his own. And we're going to look at this today because we've been studying these spiritual disciplines. I hope you've been able to put some of these into practice because that's the entire idea of these practices, is that they are like exercises for the Christian heart. That as we do them, we deepen in our relationship with God. We become connected to him more. And we start to, our own lives, put the puzzles together, put the pieces, to feel less anxiety, to feel less worry, to feel less stress, because through these practices, we're connecting with a rhythm that God has for our lives, the way he wants us to live out our lives. And today, we look at this, it's one that's called solitude. Some people combine it with silence. So it's the spiritual practice of silence and solitude. And I feel like I say this every week, but this is probably the hardest one to practice for many people, especially us, as I thought about this in this community. The people who come here on a weekly basis, and you've talked to them, they are busy people. You guys are. You're busy. Everybody's busy. Every single person in the world, in this city especially, is busy. We live in a very fast-paced, modern city of Seoul, and we're all busy, filled to the brim. I think that's the first question. If you ask somebody, how are you doing? The first response usually is, busy. And here Jesus gives us something remarkable by showing what silence and solitude can do in the life of a Christian and how the gospel makes it all possible. And silence and solitude, it's incredibly hard for me to talk about today because the very nature of our lives runs counter to silence and solitude. Because we live in this city, because we have jobs, because you're out in school, whatever it may be, everything in your life runs counter to this particular practice. And actually, by and large, the modern worldview on silence and solitude is that it's not something you should be doing. You should be making noise. You should be making progress. And since I'm preaching on silence and solitude, I wanted to give an example of why silence and solitude is so hard. Here's my example. I'm going to preach in a way I've never preached before. You ready? That wasn't even a minute. And that would freak you out, doesn't it? See, this is my point. Everything in us goes against silence. Everything in us says that you have to make noise. Even I have to make noise on a Sunday morning. If I stood here and I didn't say a word to you, you would think something's wrong with me, or you would say, well, I didn't get anything out of that sermon. I mean, we have to talk, we have to make noise, and this is why we also have to pause and just reflect this morning on what silence and what solitude can look like if you and I practice it on a regular basis. See, you guys know me, I'm an extreme introvert. Extreme, in the sense that solitude is not a problem for me. I was meditating on this week, and I said, solitude? Easy. I like being by myself. I mean, I like you too, don't worry, but I like being by myself. That's how I recharge my batteries. And then I thought, but when I'm in solitude, you know what I do usually? I pick up a book and I read, or I turn on the TV. And I think that's not silence at all. See, I love the solitude part, the silence not so much. So even if I know some of you are introverts like me and you enjoy being by yourself and you enjoy when it's quiet, but when I meditated on the type of silence and solitude that Jesus shows, in this chapter on Mark, we're going to be focusing on the one of Mark at the very end that Aaron read, verses 32 to 39. His silence is completely radical. His silence and his solitude are nothing like the silence and solitude I practice. I would love to have silence and solitude, but as soon as I do, I turn the TV on or some other distraction. Jesus shows us something very, very interesting here. If you look back at the verse 36, if you have a Bible or if you have your phone with you, look back at verse 36. He's got his followers coming out to him and they say, everybody is looking for you. They say, Jesus, everybody's looking for you. I'm going to put this in context, this passage. Jesus has just started his ministry. He's in a new job. He's in what we call the honeymoon period of that job. He's doing extremely well in that job. He's got followers. He's casting out demons. He's healing people. He's busy. He's active. Everybody wants a piece of him. Everybody. It says, everybody's looking for you. Why are you here by yourself? Everybody's looking for you. He's at the height of his popularity. He's even got a staff working for him. They're not that competent of a staff, the disciples, but they're staff nonetheless, and they're working for him. He's got a staff. He's got a full agenda. He's got it all. I mean, he could be writing a book and being on a book tour. You can imagine if his disciples said, Jesus, do you want a cup of coffee? Can we get a cup of coffee together? And he would, I don't know, he'd say, I got to heal somebody at noon. I got to go feed, I got about 5,000 people I got to feed at 1 o'clock. And at 3, people want to hear me preach, so that may take a long time. I mean, you can imagine, he has got the most full schedule. He's at the height of his popularity, the height of his ministry, and it's then that he goes silent. It's then that he goes off alone. I don't know about you, but if I was in that much demand, if people were coming to me and they ever said, you're a wonderful preacher, you should write a book, now go on a book tour, now sign my book and come to speak and give me a lecture, I would eat it up. I would take it all in. You want me to fill my schedule for that? Great, I do it. Jesus, though, does the exact opposite. When everyone's clamoring for him and his schedule can get filled with noise and with busyness, and he does his work, right? He's a good worker, he heals, but then he retreats. He preaches, then he goes off alone. And it's in his silence and his solitude, the way he does it, how he does it, that you and I think today can learn a tremendous amount about our lives and what silence and solitude can do to help us and what the gospel does to make it the case. Now, a lot of people would say, of course, Jesus went off and prayed. He's Jesus. Of course, he's going to go off and pray. And I would argue with you, yes, he is Jesus. So why would he have to go off on his own and pray? He's the Son of God. Can't he just stand in the middle of a crowd and say, this is great? Can't he just heal people again and again and again? And even Jesus, who is the Son of God, who's connected to the Father, says that in order to be more connected to the Father, I have to be alone and I have to be quiet. And I don't know about you, but that is incredibly difficult to do. I'm not there. I'm struggling with this, but here's what is very interesting. Why? And I thought to myself, why is it that we as modern day people have such a hard time being in the silence, being alone? I mean, I did that pause in my sermon for 45 seconds and I counted it, and I probably freaked you guys out a little bit. It freaked me out. It's weird looking at you and not talking and just sitting here silent. Why is that so difficult? Why is it that Jesus can work like a madman? He can work crazy and do crazy great things, miracles and healings and sermons, and then he can be balanced. And he can go off and be alone. And he can go off and be silent. And it's because in our culture, by and large, we put more importance on doing than we do on being. We put more importance on being productive than we do on just simply being who we are. There's a writer, and I put this in your outline. Let me give the background to this. Tim Kreider, he writes for the New York Times. And he did a little social experiment because he realized that his life was too busy. He realized that he had no margins in his life. He was losing it, he writes. And he noticed that this was the same with all of his friends. This is New York City, after all. You have to keep moving or you'll get trampled. And he noticed all of his friends were super, super busy, and he was super, super busy, and he couldn't figure it out why that had to be the case. So one day, he didn't tell his friends where he was going. He just packed his bags, and he went somewhere. And this was last year, 2012. So I don't know if he's still there, wherever that is. But he said where he went, it was 20 minutes to get to the nearest computer to use the internet. And it was another 20 minutes in the other direction to get to the nearest place to buy food. So I'm assuming he went somewhere desolate, somewhere away. But he reflected, and here's what he reflected on as to why we have to be busy. I don't want to read this for you, and I'm going to read it very slowly, and you can follow along with me. This is an excerpt from his thing. He looked at all of his friends in New York City, and he looked at his own life in New York City, and he made this conclusion, which is right on. He says, if you live in America in the 21st century, and this could probably be anywhere, this could be Korea, in the 21st century, you've probably had to listen to a lot of people tell you how busy they are. It's become the default response when you ask anybody how they're doing. Busy, they say. So busy. Crazy busy. It is pretty obviously a boast disguised as a complaint. And the stock response is kind of a congratulation. That's a good problem to have, people say, or better than the opposite. He goes on to say, almost everyone I know is busy. They feel anxious and guilty when they aren't either working or doing something to promote their work. They schedule in time with friends the way students with 4.0 GPAs make sure to sign up for community service because it looks good on their college applications. This is the best part. I recently wrote a friend to ask if he wanted to do something this week. And he answered that he didn't have a lot of time, but if something was going on, to let him know, and maybe he could ditch work for a few hours. I wanted to clarify that my question had not been a preliminary heads up to some future invitation. No, this was the invitation. But his busyness was like some vast churning noise through which he was shouting at me. And I just gave up trying to shout back over it. And here's his conclusion. Busyness serves as a kind of existential reassurance, a hedge against emptiness. Obviously, your life cannot possibly be silly or trivial or meaningless if you are so busy, completely booked, and in demand every hour of the day. He says it's an existential reassurance. You and I, we tend to make ourselves busy because it's a hedge against the emptiness, but the emptiness is there. Tim Kreider says, look at my friends. Look, he makes this kind of hilarious story that he tells his friend, do you want to do something this week? And the friend says, well, let me know if something comes up. And he says, this is the thing. Don't you get it? And busyness from his friend was like a turbine noise that he just got tired of shouting over. And our culture does this, and it's no different from what happened in the Bible. We place an extreme importance on the doing rather than the being, on the moving forward or moving all the time or making all the noise or being busy rather than the silence and solitude. And it happened in the Bible too. Do you remember? And if you ever have time, I didn't put it in your outline. Matthew 17. This is a hilarious story. I think it's hilarious, but then again, I'm a geek for the Bible. But this is still kind of funny. The Transfiguration, you remember this, right? Jesus goes up to the mountain with Peter and a couple other disciples. And he's on the mountainside, and Elijah and Moses come down, these heavenly celestial beings. And they're talking with Jesus. Elijah, Moses, and Jesus are talking. And there's an interesting part in Matthew 17 in verse 4, and in the Greek it translates better. It says, Peter answers them. And he says, if you will, I'll build 3 tents. Now, why is that silly or interesting? Nobody was talking to Peter. This was an A and B conversation, so see your way out of it, Jesus would say. This is Jesus, Moses, and Elijah talking. And Peter has to do something. You look at him and say, stupid Peter, shut up. Enjoy the moment. You have Moses and Elijah and Jesus hanging out in front of you, and he has to answer. And nobody was even talking to him in the first place because Peter always had to be doing. He had to be making tents. He couldn't just be in the presence. An interesting line that I saw today, or this week, was, I don't even know who quoted this, it was in some newspaper. Every time we speak, our heart is on parade. Tim Kreider would say the same thing. Our speaking, our noise, our busyness is a way to parade ourselves. It's a way to say, look, I must be important because I'm so busy. And Tim Kreider says that's a hedge against emptiness. What's the alternative then? I've been spending so long now talking about how busyness is a buildup, and busyness is a hedge against that emptiness, as he says. It's an existential reassurance that we're vastly and more important than we could ever believe. Because we're so busy, what's the alternative? It's this practice of silence and solitude, but what does that do for you? Hopefully your first question to me would be, why would I bother practicing silence and solitude in my Christian life? Why is it important? What is it going to do for me? Let me give you an illustration, a little story, and then I'll make the theological point. I'll give you the story of what silence can do for you, and then I'll try to make it into the theological point. There's a story written by a Russian writer, Anton Chekhov. Some of you may know him. Famous story called The Bet. And in this story, there's a banker and a lawyer, a young lawyer. And the banker and the lawyer are arguing at the beginning of the short story. And they're arguing over which one is worse, to be put to death for a crime or to be put in solitary confinement by yourself in the silence, no contact. And the banker says, death is far better. And the lawyer says, no, solitary confinement is better, because even though you're alone, and even though it's silent, at least you're not dead. And so they make a bet. This is the bet. And they bet 2 million rubles, which converts to something like 60,000 US dollars, which at this time would have been a lifetime worth of money. They bet 2 million rubles, and the banker says, if you can spend 5 years, he says to the lawyer, in solitary confinement, I will pay you the 2 million rubles. You'll be set for life. And the lawyer, because he's young and brash, says, I'll do you better. I'll spend 15 years. And so they have an arrangement where he goes into the house, the guest house of the banker. He's allowed no contact with anybody. He's got guards who watch him from the windows, but he can't see them. They pass food to him under the table, so he never has any contact. He's allowed anything he wants. So he asks for like a piano. He asks for all these books on science and psychology and everything, and then eventually religion. They notice something interesting. The first year or two, he's playing piano. He's walking back and forth, talking to himself. The guards hear this and they see this. A couple years go by and they don't hear the piano anymore. They only peer at him through the windows and they see him sitting at the table, reading books. A few more years go by. Now it's about the 12th or the 13th year. And as they look into him every single time, he's only sitting at the table. He never moves. And he's reading the Bible. And he's going all through the Bible, page after page after page. Complete silence and complete solitude. Now, towards the end of the story, it's the 15th year. The bet's up. The banker has to pay this man. The problem is the banker has gotten into financial problems. The banker's almost gone bankrupt because he's made bad financial decisions. And he says to himself, if I pay this man that money, I will be in the poorhouse. He'll be set for life, but I'll be in the poorhouse. So he makes a plan and he says, I'm going to kill this man. In his sleep, the night before the bet is due, the bet is over at noon the next day, and he has to pay him. So he sneaks into his room at night, but he notices a letter that's sitting on the counter. The man is softly asleep, and the letter is sitting there. So the banker picks up the letter and he reads it. And I gave you an excerpt from it. The lawyer says, tomorrow at 12 o'clock I shall be free. And this is what silence and solitude can teach you. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock I shall be free, but before leaving this room, I find it necessary to say a few words to you. All is worthless and false, hollow and deceiving like the mirage. You may be proud, wise, and beautiful, but death will wipe you away from the face of the earth, as it does the mice that live beneath your floor. Your heirs, your history, your immortal geniuses will freeze or burn with the destruction of the earth. And the banker puts the letter back down, and he leaves. He doesn't kill him. 7 o'clock the next morning, the lawyer sneaks out of the house, and he gives up on the bet, and he renounces it. And what Chekhov is trying to say here, and what he said in some notes after the story, is he's trying to say this: the lawyer got it. Now, we know all is not worthless. There is worth in this world. But the lawyer knew that it was the mirage. His life, his law degrees, his busyness, all of it was a mirage. It was, as Tim Kreider says, it was the hedge against emptiness. It was the existential reassurance. And he says, I don't need this anymore. Silence and solitude revealed to the lawyer that it was a mirage. It gave him the ultimate perspective on life. And because of that, he renounced the money. He said, even that I don't need. Because in solitude, what he did was he discovered what life was really about. And I think this is why Jesus always retreated. That was the story. Here's the theology. Jesus always retreated because he knew that his value in life was not determined by the number of miracles he performed or the number of great sermons he preached. He knew that the value in his life was given to him by something outside of that. He was infinitely more valuable. See, the lawyer says, you'll disappear like the mice. Yes, you will. I know this. But Jesus says, don't you realize that? Your busyness just masks the mirage. Your busyness just covers up the emptiness, but the emptiness is still there. The lawyer says it's still there. Busyness serves as a kind of existential reassurance. How do you and I get comfortable in the solitude and the silence? I don't think you should take a bet and go away for 15 years. Please, come back next week, I'm begging you. Don't do that. But in that solitude and silence, what you can do, if you practice this, what you can do is learn something. You can learn that why Jesus did it is because he wasn't as valuable as his last sermon. He was valuable because God called him valuable. And God today calls you and me valuable because there was another time that Jesus went away and he went into solitude. And he went into silence. And if you remember this, it was from the book of Luke. In chapter 22, verse 39, it says he came out and went. And this time, it was in the garden. And this time, he knew that he was never going to come back. Jesus knew this was the ultimate solitude. And he knew that when he went to the cross, he was going to hear the immortal silence of his Father. He cries out to his dad, and his dad says nothing to him. And he does it for you and me. Jesus says, listen, busy up your life to feel valuable. You'll never get away with the emptiness. You can be silent and you can be alone because your value is not your job. Your value is not your school. Your value is because Jesus went to the cross for you. That's how valuable you are. We all will be wiped away like the mice under our floors. But Jesus says, when you get wiped away, know that because I got wiped away for you, you will live in glory. Can you rest in that? Can you sit in silence and ponder that miracle? The gospel gives us peace. This good news gives us peace in our life. It gives us stillness because it says that Jesus took on the ultimate silent treatment from his Father so that we never will hear the silent treatment from God. Nothing we do deserves it, no matter how busy we are, no matter what we've accomplished. And Jesus says, what I accomplished for you did it. Now God looks at you and says, you are precious. You are valuable. And you really have two choices. You can either be a Macbeth, when they say life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour on the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I'm asking today, do we want our lives to be filled with sound and fury, signifying nothing? A tale told by an idiot, always busy, never still. Macbeth says, he knew it. He says he was very cynical. Life is a tale told by an idiot because it's full of sound and fury. It means nothing. And Jesus says, no, calm your hearts. Come to me in my cross. Learn the gospel. Teach it to yourself again and again. And by grace, you'll know, as John Newton wrote in that amazing song, Amazing Grace, which actually, this is a verse we don't sing because we're usually too busy. We sing the first verse, the second verse, and the last verse of Amazing Grace, and we skip this one that's in the middle because we're running out of time usually. And he says this, John Newton, yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. A life of joy and peace resting in the gospel truth about your and my value, or a life of sound of fury trying to prove our value. The gospel grants us this freedom if we just be quiet enough to hear God saying, you're good, you're precious. And I said every time I was going to get practical with you as I close, I put books there on your list. If you want to read more about what this silence and solitude thing means and how to practice it, I'm going to encourage you to do this. Here's a homework assignment. This week, every day, try to take 5 minutes. And I realized I did 5 minutes for prayer through a few weeks ago, then I did 5 minutes on meditation. So I'm taking up 15 minutes of your precious lives. I know this, but I'm encouraging you to do this. 5 minutes. And you guys with kids, it's harder. Shut the door, go someplace quiet, turn out the phone, get away from the computer, no TV, no nothing. Try it out. It will speak to you. Try it for 5 minutes tomorrow. Start today if you want. If you want to be super holy on Sunday. 5 minutes today, 5 minutes tomorrow. Try it this week, come back to me, and let's talk about it next week. I guarantee you, it's a money-back guarantee. I guarantee you, you will feel calm. You will feel the margins in your life start to move. You will feel that calm reassurance that the busyness doesn't have to be the hedge. Jesus was your hedge. That he died for you and me. Let's pray. Lord, we have